Hey guys, I'm Dov, and today I'm here with a video about how to read stat cards in Total War Warhammer. Now this video is being recorded in Total War Warhammer 2. Some of the formula I talk about may change from game to game. Some of them did change slightly from game 1 to game 2, but in general these stats should mean the same thing even into game 3. The specific values may change, but hopefully this video will be somewhat future-proof and help you guys prepare. As oncoming patches come, you can kind of analyze the new stuff and kind of make sense of it. Try and figure out your own builds, because anyone can go watch a video of myself or Turn or Goblin King or whoever and get a build, but to be able to kind of see for yourself, especially when new content releases and it's kind of that Wild West time period where people are trying to learn the new stuff, you can analyze for yourselves and look at the stat cards and look through the new stuff and potential changes and figure things out for yourselves. So let's get straight to it. Well, actually, at first, a couple things. Big thanks to twwstats.com for the help. I did a lot of research there. It's a big database of all the Total War Warhammer units. It has their stats. It's basically just a stat database. It has their stats, effects, also has a lot of information about, you can look at difficulty scaling, how that affects units that the AI are going to be using. I won't cover that really here, but it also talks about quite a few other things. You can compare units one-to-one, and it's a very, very useful resource. So I'll have a link down in the description below. And the second thing is, throughout the video I'm going to be perpetually saying if you mouse over you'll get more information. It's a good rule of thumb to just, if you want to learn more or if something's not super clear, mouse over it and it will usually pop up and give you some more information. So let's get started. So first thing you look at when you look at a unit stat card, obviously you have the name of the unit, the icon, the banner, which is good to make note of, and then a few traits which kind of tell you at a glance a few things about the unit. Now keep in mind these are not always super accurate, but if you want to learn more, of course, you can always mouse over them, but we're going to skip these for now as it is more important to analyze the actual stats themselves. These are usually accurate, but they don't give you the whole picture, and it's better to take a look at these stats below. So first things first, we've got the model count and entity size. So Total War Warhammer in particular, as compared to other Total War games, has a huge variability in the number of unit models a unit can have. For example, heroic units, of course, are only a single unit model. There are many other single unit model monsters, war machines, and so on, such as the steam tank for the Empire. It's a single unit model. Whereas infantry tend to come in, 75 to about 120, depending on the unit. Cavalry typically are about 45, sometimes more, sometimes less, especially in the case of a monstrous cav like the Demigryph Knights here. But yeah, generally you can see the model counts vary quite a bit. The other thing you'll note here is the entity size. So there's a bonus versus large and bonus versus infantry, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But this is basically shows you which the unit is. So like spearmen obviously are infantry, so they're a small entity size. If you mouse over, you can see this unit is a small entity. Cavalry obviously are going to be large entity size. So bonus versus large applies to them. Bonus versus infantry applies to small units. A lot of lords and heroes can take different mounts that will change their status. Like for example, if we put Karl Franz on foot, he turns into a small entity. Obviously, any of his mounts are going to make him a large entity, so that is something else to make note of. Moving on then, health is the measure of your unit's life force, raw life force, and together with leadership, measure your unit's overall fighting capability in terms of how long they can sustain the fight. So obviously, successful hits against your unit will decrease their HP. And if their HP disappears completely, the unit is wiped out. Oftentimes they will rout before that. We'll get to leadership in just a moment here, but a couple of other notes about health and healing. Healing is a big part of the game, and all units have a healing cap, which means they have a percentage based on their total HP of how much they can heal. Again, it is based on the total HP, so theoretically units with more HP can be healed more. Now there's an important distinction about unit models here and units with more unit models. Karl Franz and the other heroic units here obviously are single unit models, so you're going to be able to perpetually heal them all the way, whereas units without units with multiple unit models like these spearmen and swordsmen, for example. They have 90 unit models. So let's say they've been in battle, they've taken some casualties, they only have 65 left. Well, each individual model within that unit has a set number of HP, right? This HP pool is divided up between these 90 guys. And each model, if it goes down, it's out, right? You can't heal that model except for a handful of spells that actually resurrect, but those are very, very niche and limited to only a few factions. Typically, you can't resurrect a unit model, so that means you can only heal up to the max number of units that are still alive. So, for example, like I was saying with these guys, if they were, let's say they had 73 unit models left, you could only heal up to those 73 unit models' health, even if you have healing cap space left, just because the models have reached their max HP. So you got to be careful casting healing on high model count units if you've lost a lot in particular, because you may not get the best value out of it. If the models remaining still have a lot of HP, like if the models remaining are pretty close to their max, but the models that died are mainly what's taking up the HP loss, then you're not going to get as good a value out of the healing. So it's something to consider with multi-model count units when you're healing them. Yeah, and now moving on to leadership. This is kind of the other measure of your unit's ability to sustain the fight. It's their will to fight. So if the leadership breaks, a unit will run away, or in the case of undead, and I'm assuming demons will work the same way. I don't know for sure, but they work this way on tabletop, so I'm assuming it'll be the same. They crumble rather than rout, which is a little bit different. We'll talk about that in a minute. When a unit runs away, it's defenseless. It will immediately just flee the field. Or try to, at least, and at that point it's defenseless, more or less, so you can chase them down and get them off the field. Now, units that have been routed and not shattered can come back to the fight, and so it's important to chase down routing units and finish them off. In particular, if a unit has regeneration, if you let it rally and come back, it could potentially regenerate a lot of hit points, and so suddenly you're going to be dealing with a unit that just a moment ago might be very weak, but suddenly is now very strong again. So leadership, very, very important, and it's affected by a whole bunch of different things. Your lord, if he's nearby, he has an encourage aura. All heroic units, in fact, have an encourage aura, which gives a leadership bonus to an area of effect around them. If your lord dies or routs, that will affect all your units' leadership. If a unit has its flanks secure by friendly units, that gives it a bonus. If the flank is compromised, or if it's getting charged in the rear or side, that gives a major penalty to leadership, obviously. If a unit is winning, it gives a bonus. If a unit is losing, it gives a debuff. And all the damage sustained, the more HP damage you take, the more morale damage you'll take, the leadership damage you'll take as well. So losses sustained, losing your lord, getting charged in the rear, getting shot at by artillery. There's tons of different debuffs that affect the game, that affect leadership in the game as well. Magic effects, and in particular I want to touch on fear and terror very quickly because they very much relate to leadership. Fear is just a general leadership debuff. It just lowers the leadership of all units nearby, and terror causes a unit to rout if it reaches a certain threshold, a certain low threshold. Units that cause fear and terror are immune, of course, and units that are immune to psychology are immune to those effects as well. So yeah, just a few notes about leadership. It's an incredibly important stat, and low leadership factions like the Greenskins, there's a lot of counterplay you can do with stacking leadership debuffs, try and rout off healthy, otherwise units that could be relatively high on HP, but just because they have relatively poor leadership, you can really punish them in that way. So moving on here, we're going to skip armor and speed for now and talk about melee attack and defense. So your melee attack and defense are your chance to hit and chance to parry. For you tabletop players, this is these two stats combined are sort of a measure of your weapon skill. I use the term weapon skill in my replays and combat stats as well. I kind of use them interchangeably. That's generally referring to melee attack and defense. Now it's a chance to hit, so every time a unit model makes an attack animation, there's a chance to hit. And it's a dice roll between the melee attack of the attacking unit and the melee defense of the defending unit. and the chance to hit is a 35% base, I believe. Anyone feel free to correct me in the comments if I'm wrong on any of these formula, but it's a 35% base chance to hit, and then for every point of melee attack over melee defense, you'll get an additional percentage point, and vice versa. So every percentage point below your opponent's melee defense for the attacker will reduce the chance to hit. Now, there is a point of diminishing returns in both directions. Again, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I believe it's 8% chance to hit on the low end and 92% chance to hit on the high end. Now, this is one of the formula that did change from Total War Warhammer 1 to 2, so it's possible it could change to Game 3, but it's one of the reasons why combat stats have become more important, in my opinion, in Total War Warhammer 2 because of these minor tweaks. And what they did is they slightly lowered, I believe it was 10% before, the point of diminishing returns. So they slightly lowered the point of diminishing returns downward and raised it upward, which means that combat stats are more effective. They also reduced the base chance to hit. I believe it was 40% before, now it's 35%. So overall combat stats became more important. Previously I would have said the biggest indication is probably weapon strength versus armor, but now it's probably the unit's combat stats. Not always, but typically unit weapon melee attack and defense will determine who's the winner. Obviously there's a lot of other stuff that can happen, but generally in a one-on-one situation, the unit with the better combat stats will typically win. Now there are some differences to that. Of course, armor and weapon strength play a big role, and that's where we'll move next. So with the armor stat here, you can see units that have a missile block chance. We have a little icon here, either bronze or silver. It is possible to actually get gold shields with some effects, but no units in the game have that as a baseline. But like goblins, for example, they're pretty small. They can hide behind a tiny shield. 55% missile block chance. Again, if you mouse over the icon, it'll show you in more detail. 55% for a silver shield, and the bronze shield here is, I believe, 35%. Yep, 35%. So small arms fire, not artillery fire, but bow fire and, handgunner fire, that sort of thing coming in from the front has that percentage chance to be blocked. So obviously if you're shooting them in the unshielded flank or in the rear, it will circumvent that missile block chance. But yeah, it's important to note. And then the armor stat itself, and armor will apply to both melee and missile attacks. And I'm going to talk about armor and weapon strength in tandem because they're tied. So when a unit makes successful contact on a melee attack, or else they hit with a ranged attack, you're going to deal some damage. Now, all units have some amount of armor piercing. If you mouse over their weapon strength, it'll show you a breakdown of what they can do. So spearmen, for example, have 6 armor piercing baseline. So all units have armor piercing. Even the goblins and the peasants and the filthiest of zombies all have armor piercing, some amount. And then obviously you have your base weapon strength and bonus versus large, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But base weapon strength versus armor is it's a chance to mitigate between half the armor value and the armor value percentage of the non-armor piercing weapon strength. Now, what that means in English is, for example, these spearmen with shields would mitigate between 15% and 30% of non-armor piercing damage against them. Reichsguard, then, for example, have 120 armor, so the 50% low value for them, right, because it's a 50 to 100% of their armor, so that's 60, right? And so you're going to be mitigating between 60 and 100% of the non-armor piercing damage. Obviously, you can't mitigate more than 100% of the non-armor piercing damage, but that's why above 100 armor you start to get a little bit of diminishing returns. Obviously, with 100 armor, you will mitigate between 50 and 100% of the non-armor piercing damage. Once you start to go over that, you're going to bring your bottom value up, but you can't really, again, you can't mitigate more than 100% of the non-armor piercing damage. So units like the Ragnarok Queen, for example, are baseline, on the low end chance are going to mitigate 75% of the non-armor piercing damage because the Ragnarok Spider has 150 armor. So obviously you don't ever want to go over 200 armor. There's only a handful of units in the game that are in the 150 to 160 range. including the Arachnarok Spider, a few of the Lizardmen monsters, and I believe the Steam Tank is in that bracket as well. Yeah, 160, so again, the half value is 80, so it's going to mitigate between 80 and 100% of the non-armor piercing attacks against it. Hope that kind of makes sense for you guys. Obviously, you wouldn't want to put like a Flesh to Stone on a Steam Tank, for example, because that plus 60 armor is going to put you at 220, which, I mean, you're going to mitigate always 100% of the non-armor piercing damage, but you're kind of wasting that extra 20 armor because, again, over 100 you start to get a little bit of diminishing returns. It is useful up to 200, but still, you start to get diminishing returns over that 100 value. So yeah, that pretty much sums up armor and weapon strength relatively well. Missile damage is similar. Now, missile damage is measured over 10 seconds. So this factors in a few things: the base missile damage as well as the reload time, because it's over a 10-second value. Now, some units, like Pistoliers, for example, fire multiple shots per volley, and they will reflect that in their missile damage. You can see 2 shots per volley. Artillery will have the explosion damage as well, which can sometimes be a little bit hard to understand, but this overall over 10 seconds value is usually pretty good. But yeah, again, all units that have ranged attacks have some armor piercing. You can see the Pistoliers here have 2 armor piercing per shot, and while the Outriders obviously have the majority armor piercing at 15 AP per shot. So yeah, again, all units have some armor piercing both in melee and ranged, and the non-armor piercing damage is what's mitigated obviously by the armor. So yeah, that's weapon damage, missile damage, and armor, all in a nutshell. Speed is obviously fairly straightforward and is a little bit related to charge. Speed obviously measures how fast your unit can go. Flying units, it's important to know, have a different ground speed than they do in the air, and the speed shown on the stat card is their speed in the air. So for example, Karl Franz on Deathclaw has 90 speed up in the air, but I'm not 100% sure what his speed is on the ground. Again, if you go to twwstats.com, I believe he has those listed there. But yeah, just make a note of that. And charge bonus, of course, is going to give you extra charge. So charge bonus applies, let's see here if I can find the actual... sorry, just looking through my notes here. Okay, and charge bonus adds melee attack 1-to-1. It's a bonus that applies when you charge, and then it fades linearly, which is hard to say, over 13 seconds. So it fades over 13 seconds. Your charge bonus will wear off over time, and it yeah, it adds to the melee attack. It also adds to the weapon strength, typically along the proportion of armor piercing to non-armor piercing that the unit has anyway. Sometimes it can vary a little bit here and there, but like Karl Franz, for example, the majority of that damage, extra weapon damage applied by the charge bonus would be armor piercing, because the majority of his attacks are armor piercing anyway. It used to be different in other Total War titles, but that's the way it works now. I know that has caused some confusion even with myself, but yeah, the charge bonus, I mean, it does apply extra armor piercing damage, and of course extra weapon damage means potentially some of that non-armor piercing damage can get through. The bonus melee attack, of course, means they're much more likely to score hits, so generally charges are good. There's a couple other things about charges as well. Is some units have a charge, well, all units have a charge speed and a charge animation that sometimes is slightly faster than their base speed. Yeah, charging is generally very useful. Some units have charge defense, so like charge defense against large, for example. If a large entity unit, remember again this is marked here, if a large entity unit charges this from the front, it'll negate the charge bonus, so they won't get that bonus melee attack and weapon strength if they charge this unit from the front. There are a handful of units that have charge defense against all, which means, or expert charge defense, which means any unit that charges it will have that entire charge bonus mitigated. There's also another element to charging, which is impact damage. Impact damage, I don't know exactly the values of it, but it seems to be, based on my experience, a measurement of the unit's mass versus perhaps the armor, because it definitely seems that lower armor units take significantly more impact damage, and you'll only really take impact damage from something large charging you, like cavalry, chariots, or a big monster. I'm not 100% sure on the values, but it is a measurement against armor, because lower armor units tend to take a lot more shock damage, a lot more impact damage on that initial point of the charge, whereas a heavier armor unit will weather that initial part of the charge well, but then, you know, as the unit models attack and over that 13 seconds, their charge bonus is still applied. They'll do damage during that time rather than the initial impact. So yeah, impact damage, another kind of hidden aspect to charges. So we've pretty much talked about all the primary stats at this point. Missile units obviously do have range and ammunition. Fairly self-explanatory. Range is how far you can shoot. Ammunition is how many times you can shoot. Keep in mind as well that units that have multiple shots per volley will consume multiple shots per volley, so you need to keep in mind when looking at their ammo stat about that. At least I believe it's that case. Someone correct me if I'm wrong on that, but anyway. Yeah, overall it's sometimes it's not super clear on these stats. The melee attack and defense, I know I had to do a little bit of digging, and the armor values as well for the formula. I had to do a little bit of digging to find them, and again, they can change from game to game. They did change from Total War Warhammer 1 to 2, at least the melee stats did. So yeah, next we'll go over abilities. So all units down here at the bottom you can see have traits and abilities. Yeah, so, or I guess I would go to call them attributes. These are more traits here, but like there's missile resistance, magic resistance, and fire resistance, for example. There's also damage resistance, which all apply against the appropriate type. Again, if you ever are curious about any of these abilities, you can mouse over them to learn a little bit more. Missile attacks, including artillery, are mitigated by this amount. Whereas, for example, if we take a look at Chaos here, we can see Big Bird, one of my favorite legendary lords, as you may or may not know. He's got missile resistance and, again, magic resistance. Magic attacks and spells that deal magic damage, obviously, are going to be mitigated by that amount. Physical resistance as well. If we look at Britonia, their Grail tier units, if we look here, have this effect here, which gives physical resistance. Physical resistance, of course, mitigates physical attacks and is bypassed by magic damage. Likewise, of course, magic resistance will mitigate magic attacks. Fire damage and fire resistance only apply to each other. But it's worth noting that the standard regeneration trait that many units in the game have, especially on the Vampire Counts roster, a few others as well, but the standard regeneration trait does give a 25% weakness to fire. Now, fire damage, contrary to some confusion, doesn't circumvent physical resistance. A lot of units that have fire damage also have magic damage, so there is some confusion there, but no, it only is pertinent if the unit has a weakness or resistance to fire. So yeah, there's other traits as well. Expert charge defense is one I talked about. The Sternsmen have got that. Charge defense against large. Unbreakable is another one that's almost universal across a lot of different factions. This unit will not rout, so leadership damage doesn't matter at all for these guys. They will fight to the bitter end. You know, there's a lot of other traits that you guys can go through and look at your own leisure that are across a lot of different factions. Vanguard deployment means you can deploy outside your deployment zone in a further area. Hide obviously means you can hide in a forest. Fire while moving. Again, most of these are fairly self-explanatory. If you mouse over them, it will tell you what they do. So a lot of units have actual abilities too, rather than just these attributes. These are active effects that can either be constant or activatable. So for example, Flagellants here have Frenzy, which is a constant effect that gives them some bonuses. These effects can be very widely varied and have a lot of different types of effects, so there's way too many for me to go through now, but just remember when you're looking at a unit card and trying to analyze it to check down here at what abilities the unit has. And yeah, obviously there are spells as well for magic users. Now magic, specifically spells, will have a magic cost. Winds of Magic is a resource obviously you get within battle, a little bit outside the scope here, but just keep in mind that if you see that little spell cost there, the little sort of magic symbol in the corner of the box that's popping up there when I mouse over these guys with the blue number associated with the Winds of Magic cost, if you see that next to an ability, that means it's a spell. So just a little tip there. And yeah, that pretty much wraps that portion of it up. Again, this is a portion where you really do want to go through and mouse over things if you're not sure what something does, especially when you're analyzing new stuff. So yeah, a couple things I want to touch on further. A lot of units have bound effects on their attacks, either in melee or at ranged. Poison is one of the most common, so you'll see the effect denoted next to the melee attack or the missile. For example, in the case of the Luminarch, it does flaming magic damage, so you see that denoted next to the ammunition there. But these bound effects, obviously, flaming magic damage, we talked about those. Poison applies a debuff, which, again, if you want to know more, you can mouse over. The Dark Elves, for example, have the Witch Elves who have their bound debuff. There's quite a few effects in the game now that are bound on melee attacks, so if you see a symbol here you don't recognize, you definitely want to mouse over it and check to see what it does. And yeah, there's a few more stats in the game that aren't available immediately on this stat card that you do need to consider. Vigor is one of them, and now as your units fight and do various things, they'll get tired. Your vigor is a measure of that tiredness, so it affects speed, melee attack, reload time, charge bonus, and armor. Now, how much it affects is dependent on you know, how tired you are. There are several tiers of exhaustion that you can go through, and some of them are not mitigated at all at some of the earlier tiers, but as you get into the lower tiers, especially very tired and exhausted, you're going to face some debuffs to your speed in particular. Of course, that makes sense. It's 5% per threshold down to 85% speed. Melee attack is about 10 per threshold down to 70%, so you'll go down to about 70% effectiveness there. Reload is about 10 to 15% per threshold down to 65 when you're exhausted. Charge bonus is tired and lower, so at the earlier stages you don't face any penalty to your charge bonus, but at tired and lower you're going to go through successive debuffs down to 70. And armor, if you're very tired or exhausted, you're going to go either 90% or 75% effectiveness. So, you know, you'll be facing about 10 to 15%, sometimes up to 25 or more percent diminishing effectiveness when your units are tired, which is why vigor is very, very important, especially in long grindy games, which is what makes units with perfect vigor so strong in those types of games. There are a few units that do have the perfect vigor trait. The Grail Knights, who we were looking at earlier, do have it. It's this little green symbol here, perfect vigor, so regardless of how long the battle takes, how much they're running around, charging, fighting, whatever, these guys will never get tired. It's an incredibly useful trait. There are also a few abilities in the game that refresh vigor, like Foe Seeker that a lot of heroic units have, gives an 18% vigor refresh. Grumbling Guard, of course, have an aura vigor refresh. There's a lot of other things that can refresh your vigor, and that will keep your units fighting at full strength. So yeah, there are a few other hidden stats. Mass is one of them, attack speed, animations as well. These are things to consider when your units are fighting, but those are a little bit outside the scope of this particular video. But yeah, that's pretty much been all for now. Let me know your guys' thoughts in the comments down below. I hope I haven't missed anything. Oh yeah, I do know what I missed. Bonus versus large and bonus versus infantry. Just briefly, on weapon strength. So when they have bonus versus large, bonus versus infantry, obviously it applies to the appropriate target, large or small, and it adds 1-to-1 to the melee attack. So in the case of these men-at-arms with polearms here, they would add 17 to their melee attack, bringing them up to 35 in total when attacking the appropriate target. And it also adds that amount to the weapon strength, proportional to the damage they do armor piercing to base. So the 17, you know, I don't know exactly what the proportion is, but it would likely be, well, it would be mostly armor piercing and some base. Exactly the values I'm not 100% sure, as it can vary slightly from unit to unit, but generally the bonus versus large or bonus versus infantry is applied at the same proportion as the unit's base weapon strength, as is charge bonus. So hopefully that clears up some of the confusion on that end. That was one thing I almost forgot there. Glad I caught that before I signed off here. But yeah, that is pretty much everything. Let me know in the comments down below if you guys have questions. Once the new stuff comes out, the DLC and Norska and all that, I'm going to be going through a full analysis, and we'll go with Norska, talk about the whole faction, and then we'll do some stuff for the other things as well, obviously, and go through the new stuff and the balance changes, and look at the stats and try and come up with, even before we step foot on the battlefield, try and come up with how these units can be used, what kind of synergies we can look for, and just kind of do a stat card analysis of the new stuff when it comes out. So stay tuned for that. I hope you guys have found this video useful. If you do like this kind of content, be sure to like, subscribe, hit that bell notification button so that every time I upload a new video, you'll be notified. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.